It's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom. And the song is the song of love. Love between all of my brothers.
I've gotten used to a games market where the largest, most technically complicated games have a very corporate feel to them. When I was growing up, in the long-ago era where PC games came in enormous boxes with enormous manuals, the idea that a developer would put a personal stamp on a game was a given. Personalities drove studios, like Romero and Carmack, like Sid Meier, even whole studio personalities like you have with Black Isle. When you look at something like Fallout 4 versus the original Fallout, one of the things that really stands out, besides the unbelievable advancements in technology, is that the newer game lacks the sense of authorial presence that the original game had. You can't really picture the people who made it. It's difficult to get a handle on their personal artistic values. Everything is much more about marketability and features than it was back in the day. A huge reason for this is cost of production, of course. It takes hundreds more people and hundreds of thousands more dollars to make big releases than it used to. The personal touch doesn't quite matter so much if the developer goes bankrupt in the process. Homefront: The Revolution was a game that I expected to be incredibly corporate, the kind of design-by-committee, personality-free marketability that made the original Homefront so overwhelmingly dislikable. It wasn't at all. Instead, Homefront: The Revolution was a game that, once you got past its rather silly premise of North Korea being a global superpower capable of a continent-wide invasion, was actually a really deep and articulate game in its local world-building, compulsive and creative in how it arranged its urban open-world space. It felt like something real human passion and artistic thought had gone into. I've read a number of editorials that are dismissive toward the game because of its rah-rah rhetoric of a second American Revolution, because of its predictability of format, but these seem to gloss over the little details of the game, where the sense of handcrafted care is strongest. I read a number of reviews that heavily criticized bugs and performance issues that Dambusters had completely patched out when I finally got around to playing it. But the fix was already in. Meme Wisdom said Homefront: The Revolution is a bad game and a waste of money and you should feel bad for playing it. And once a game's reputation becomes a meme, it is a hell of an uphill battle to sell copies. What you'd expect to happen with today's heavily corporatized games market is for the game to be abandoned, for Dambusters to wash their hands of it and say, well guys, 4 years was a lot of work, but our Metacritic score isn't stellar and Butt Munch 2009 left us a pretty scathing Steam review, so let's throw in the towel. Why throw more resources at a game that the internet seemed to agree had failed? The only reason would be, if you cared about it, if the time investment and the emotional investment were dividends that mattered more than the principal monetary investment. To continue to devote time and resources to the game goes against the risk-averse values of today's game market. But it goes hand in glove with the values of smaller studios and simpler times, where if you've got a game that seems dented and broken, you hammer it out until it looks good again. Out of pride, out of artistic commitment. Homefront: The Revolution is such a bizarre title to see this value struggle take place in. Conventional wisdom says it's a cash grab, and by all first-glance metrics, Homefront: Revolution does look like a cash grab. But Dambusters didn't just patch it and apologize, they released 3 pieces of DLC to give it greater depth, bookending the player's experience from a prequel to an epilogue. They're not the most impressive pieces of DLC I've ever seen, but I'm not impressed so much as astonished that the Revolution would, a year after its lackluster debut, come all the way back around to satisfactorily and comprehensively conclude itself. All of the DLCs seem to substantively address common complaints about the game's presentation and plotting in the main campaign. One of the biggest dangling threads of the plot is Walker, the man who supposedly kicked off the revolution in Philadelphia with his charisma and passion. He saves Brady, the main player character, in the opening moments, gives him a smartphone to use for the rest of the game, and then promptly disappears until a plot twist 20 hours later. He's spoken of like he's a meaningful part of the world, but Walker is almost totally absent from the actual experience of the main story. Voice of Freedom puts you in Walker's shoes, with Walker given actual dialogue as opposed to the hilariously clunky silent protagonist of the main campaign. If this DLC had actually prefaced the main campaign, it would have gone a long way toward making Walker a relevant part of the universe, but Voice of Freedom would make a poor introduction to the game. Instead of the slow and steady increase of difficulty and complexity in the main campaign, this DLC puts you in a rapidly escalating series of close-quarters gunfights that ask you to use a minimum of game mechanics and resources to maximum effect. You need to either be intuitive with first-person shooters or familiar with the Revolution's rhythms to avoid reloading again and again. I hadn't played the Revolution for nearly a year and had forgotten how unforgiving the game was towards mistakes and leaving yourself exposed to being flanked. Voice of Freedom's encounters are very tightly designed, or at least one of the two is. There's a long build-up where Walker, en route to Brady's rendezvous, is forced to go on an underground detour into subway tunnels controlled by a street gang called the 90, so named for the street they all grew up on and lived together before everything went to shit. There's a solid 10 to 15 minutes of environmental exposition demonstrating the depth of banditry and cruelty they've descended into, cage fights to the death, bodies on spikes, the whole Fallout 3 treatment. All of this leads up to the DLC's one bright, shining moment, a tremendously difficult fight against about 20 members of the 90 in their assault railcar. You've got only a few shotgun shells, a couple crossbow bolts, and enough materials to craft a grenade or two to get through the battle. On a couple attempts, I even ran out of ammunition for the basic pistol. It's a genuine firefight puzzle, thought out with a solid, intense build-up. It highlights the best of Homefront's combat aesthetic, a fragile player with odds heavily stacked against them, using a hodgepodge of improvised weapons and improvised tactics to barely scrape along to victory. It pushes you so close to the margins of failure that the victories seem more meaningful. Unfortunately, the remaining 15 minutes of the DLC undermine the strengths being demonstrated. You've got to make a timed escape from the subway tunnel on motorcycle, the same clunky, funky motorcycle I hated so much in the main game. With keyboard controls, its handling is about on par with a wide-mouthed bass flailing wildly on the end of a fishing line. It's hard to have a tense escape that involves backing up and realigning your motorcycle, so often that you have to replay it several times. When you finish that, you get a wave of defense fight in the most visually boring KPA installation in the entire game. It feels not only uninspired, but unfinished, a half-formed afterthought. And then the DLC is over. The whole thing takes about 45 minutes. When you finish the wave defense fight, you get a cutscene of Walker sneaking the rest of the way through the district, taking away the player's opportunity to have a book-ending stealth sequence to complement the first 5 minutes of the DLC. It's still a pleasing loop. Voice of Freedom ends right where the player's autonomy begins in the main campaign. The next DLC, Aftermath, continues the Walker plotline and finally resolves it, extending and definitively closing the loop by, at the very end, showing Brady giving Walker back the cell phone he was given at the very beginning of the game. The student becoming the master, the rescued becoming the rescuer. The encounter design is broader, sharper, more interesting than Voice of Freedom. It feels heftier, longer, meaner. And, most shocking of all, Brady speaks. Jack Parrish, Resistance leader of the main campaign, has lived through his being shot at the climactic mission. He's here to give you another briefing. But this time, Brady talks back. He participates. He acts as an actual character and not just a vessel for Parrish to pour open-world objectives into. Parrish even, pretty hilariously, complains that he liked Brady better when Brady just kept his mouth shut. It's a great opener. The KPA is still in control, but just not full control of Philadelphia. You've won great battles, but the outlook of the war is still very bleak. Walker's the focus of this DLC, taking the mid-game plot twist where he makes a television appeal on behalf of the KPA and extending it, revealing that he's still doing the broadcasts. The main campaign ended on such a triumphant note, but for the people of the Revolution, it's just an emotional high point before weeks and months more of hardship and struggle. Walker is a consistently demoralizing voice in this, bleeding out popular support and eroding the sense of victory on a daily basis. Optics and propaganda are as powerful a weapon of war as a tank or an assault rifle. Even if the Resistance has made hard progress on the battlefield, Walker, the voice of freedom himself, says there's no end in sight and no point to the Resistance. So why bother? Parrish sends Brady to kill Walker, which is a good setup, but not exactly what I was hoping for. I wanted a new neighborhood. I wanted more open-world objectives. While Aftermath isn't as much of a literal corridor shooter as the previous DLC, it is still just a linear progression of set-piece battles and encounters. The approach to the television station where Walker is presumed to be kept is a surprisingly large open area designed to allow for stealth gameplay. But once you're past that, it's back to wave defense and huge set-piece arena fights. It's a real shame to have the strengths of the primary game's design get subducted under the more basic themes and rhythms, the compulsive and clever arrangements of urban battlefields that change as you engage with them, swapped out for likable but unimpressive linear engagements. The result of this is a tighter focus on narrative plot over action-oriented player choice, one that sits uncomfortably with the artificial and arcadey design of the arena battles. The mix of the original game, heavy on environment, movement, and gunplay, and light on dialogue and corridors, was very tight. It was what elevated the second Homefront above the first on a moment-to-moment basis, outside the overall higher production quality of the sequel. The way Aftermath plays is closer to what I had originally expected from Homefront: The Revolution. A workman-like linear shooter with a premise and tone that can't seem to decide if it's taking itself seriously or not. Taken alone, Aftermath is not very good. It's only my affection for the main campaign and my delight in seeing the characters up and at it again, with minor tweaks, that let it land for me in a positive way. I liked having Brady save Walker. I liked hearing how Walker's betrayal of himself was grounded in his desire to save the individual lives of prisoners like him. I liked having the extra color and detail it adds to a small epilogue. But as a shooter in miniature, Aftermath is a pretty mediocre thing. It's a wonderful thing that Aftermath is not the note that the game goes out on. The final DLC took the longest and yielded the most impressive results. Here it creatively loops back on the first game by referencing the color palette and art style of the original Homefront's rural levels. This DLC is beyond the walls. It's the true climax of Homefront. Although it's as linear as the previous two installments, the level design is much more open, allowing the rhythms of urban combat from the main campaign to satisfyingly play out across shattered small towns and long-emptied diners. This encounter design preference for elimination arenas and massive set-piece battles sets it apart from the corridor shooter feel of the previous two DLCs, allowing Beyond the Walls to more successfully continue what worked best about the core gameplay of the main campaign. Plus, it's a large enough DLC to even introduce new characters and plot elements. After a long isolation, war is coming to Europe. NATO's only hope is to loosen the KPA's grip on the US before they can consolidate and pivot to the new front. Their hope is to launch a nuclear weapon from American soil, tucked away in a silo yet undiscovered by the KPA. If they can get that missile in the air, they can use the EMP to destroy the enemy network at a vulnerable moment. There has never before been any way to seriously do injury to the greater body of the invading army. Small, local victories, sure, always with the threat of overwhelming retaliation hanging overhead. Introducing this last-minute thread of actual hope is just the ticket for getting the player on board for a final push, a year's time since the original game came out. Lisa Burnell, the inexperienced NATO engineer sent in to program the missile, is given extensive character development for such a compact, niche DLC. She and Brady have actual, natural-sounding conversations. Her presence gives Brady a tentative hope that the end might finally be at hand. Beyond the Walls even throws in an actual puzzle sequence that takes a minute or two to figure out. While the scale is modest, there's a sense of real affection for the game and the world pervading the DLC, a playfulness of design that's endearing and memorable. The difficulty is memorable as well. Instead of a low-resource challenge like Voice of Freedom, Beyond the Walls has a rapid escalation of encounters until you're facing against more enemies than the main campaign ever threw at you at one time. The Goliath, the climactic tank you fought against at the very end of the game and in Aftermath, comes at you in 2s or 3s. You graduate from clearing a dozen KPA from a churchyard to cleaning entire platoons out of the dusty, abandoned suburbs of Philadelphia. Once the KPA catches wise of the resistance plan, they throw everything they have at you. My only complaint is the scale of these encounters mean that a last-minute failure in a battle sends you back 10 minutes or more to the beginning of the impressively long and complicated set-piece fights. It feels like a true and proper final push, a determined and deliberate terminal endpoint for the whole 3 or 4 dozen hours you can invest in Homefront: The Revolution. Mechanically, narratively, thematically, it all builds towards the events of this DLC, and all of these things are satisfyingly resolved. Beyond the Walls is a genuinely fun linear shooter all on its own, a small episodic battle in the larger war, but it becomes something more memorable than that when placed in order with the rest of the content. It's a rare thing in gaming, a tiding and loving farewell to a game, from the developers to the players. You can feel the pride involved in finishing what was started, despite odds and obstacles. Feel the pride and share in it, having bested quite literally every enemy the game can throw at you at once. Homefront: The Revolution is a true underdog story, and it accomplished something delightful and rare by working so hard to end on a note of real triumph. Thanks for watching. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name the people who are currently helping me produce these videos by donating $10 a month or more on Patreon. People like N.K. Jensen, David Carlson, Evan Hill, Ashley Rain, Brian Plockelman, Chris Kaon, Pay, Brandon Boat, Josh, Galak, Morton Scanning, Josh Parkus, Dewey, Niels Bach-Frommer, Spyro Sedaris, Connor Biblo, Ryan Gunst, Amir Aguilar, Sangustan, Jeffrey Knutson, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albach, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Brett Gialamo, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Ivan Marinov, Chris Larkey, Rob Clark, Aiden AK-47, Harley McAvoy, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Tizar Vicarian, Preston Allen, Kimmo Heikkinen, Ofer Elias, Sean, Alex Alcald, Erica Mikkonen, Dirk Warbrule, Matthew Mason, Majaflyer, Q-Ray X, Nathaniel Tenzar, Alexander Dmitriev, Sharif Gazemi, Trivium Art History, Rob Tackett, Martin Markov, Tim Moon, Divyath Faust, Colby Howard, John Walsh, Alex Zalato, Daniel Moramiri, Stephen Primmel, Matthew, Devin Fitzpatrick, Joe Hewison, Stephen Potyak, The German Snob, Simo Polakowski, Quitch, Jody Warren, Colin, Sudana, Cameron Jackson, Michael Atwell, Brad Carr, Cameron, Bradley Smith, Tom Vickers, Will Edwards, Cheryl DeVera, Arten Cernu, Stuntaneous, Chris Wright, Ricardo Gainda, Hercules Johnson, Daniel Pining, Free Morpheme, Cy, Clay Harrington, Anthony Bardill, Nate Williamson, Fergus Foley, Tom Painter, Kyle Hooten, Cameron Booth, Joaquin Coleman, William Davis, Stephen Garrett Day, Oscar Stengenberg, Egon Elbray, Jeanette N., Yazan Barguli, Sean Lees, Dios, Sergei Miloshishek, John Paul Harsh, Ray Sawyer, Max Fincher, Calypse, Devin Vernon, Balder Carlson, Carl Clark, Max Wellington, Jonathan Holder, Rich Storr, Charles Favreau, Kim Winson, Scott Miller, Carol Henderson, Bradley J. Fisher, Matthias Hellstrand, Niles D. McDonald, Will Dobbins, Tom Rowerding, Jonas Martinson, Will Wargrave, Jack Harvey, Jack Dawson, Michael Connor, D. Stex, Jacob Robertson, Andrew Schiffel, Kevin Schaub, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, Austin Green, Sorcerer Dave, Mike Downing, Tim Dorney, Daniel Barsh, Andrew Tapp, Lassalis, Brynock, Leong Zhao, Medal of Connor, Jesse Wilkinson, Michael Mataluski, Lori Ramey, Simon Nearfolk, Peter Rodowski, Argus Swift, Chris Slight, Andre Bregeger, Matthew Sutton, Ryan Van Dyke, Antonio Joseph Doval III, Robert Glover, Thomas Whitty, Stephen Francisco Santana, Diller, Sebastian Premel, Thunder O'Brien, Nobody, Michael Benson, Kumaran Vijan, Justin Hughes, Igor Babiak, Brian Hill, Alexander Leister, Julius Dean, Clayton, Casey Pioli, World War II Freak, Dalton Seiler, Jake Brennan, Dennis Clark, Jake Mays, Will Hooten, Eli Bergmass, Nick Cole Hamilton, Soabe Sheik, Eddie Burton, Marcus Burson, Christian Zachariason, Gabriel Nichols, Ron Gervais, Tom, and Comfy Hat. Thank you all so much for making these videos possible.